You can never have too many weapons around the quarterback in the NFL, but given Ben Johnson's offensive prowess and Caleb Williams' potential, are the Chicago Bears reaching the point where they at least have enough to get by?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we'll look at the Chicago Bears addition of free agent wide receiver Olamide Zaccheaus, a couple of other free agent wide receivers brought in for a visit on Monday, Rondale Moore and Mecole Hardman in particular. And that's our way of sort of jumping off and saying, okay, now you've got some receivers, got a couple tight ends, got a couple running backs. Like, have the Bears reached this point now where they have enough? They could always want more, but have you kind of reached the saturation point of, like, you've got everything, the minimums of what you need from your weapons, and everything else you add on top of that is gravy? Or is there still more of a vacancy here that needs to be filled with more talent? We'll look at it from a receiver perspective, but also tight end and running back, the full gamut of weapons around Caleb Williams. But I think we need to start by getting to know a little better the new number 3 wide receiver the Bears signed. I think the signing technically was made official on Monday, but it was announced over the weekend that they'd be signing most recently former Washington Commander Olamide Zaccheaus. He'd been with Washington this past season with Jaden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury and Dan Quinn. The year before that, he was with the Philadelphia Eagles, and then he spent the first 4 years of his career with the Atlanta Falcons. On yesterday's podcast, we talked to Locked On Falcons host Aaron Freeman, and in our third segment yesterday, at the end, we talked about Zaccheaus and sort of his ascension in Atlanta and why ultimately they didn't end up keeping him around in Atlanta. But to try and, I want to take this a step further now and look at how he fits in with the Chicago Bears, what this ends up looking like in this Bears offense. Because over the course of Zaccheaus' career, we've kind of seen him, he's not going to be a number 1, number 2 type receiver. He's not a 1,000-yard guy, but he is a guy who, a smaller slot receiver type of weapon who I think can have a real role here in this Bears offense. You look at how he was used this past season with the Washington Commanders and Cliff Kingsbury, where he had what I believe it was a not quite a career high, but it was a career high 45 catches, not quite a career high in receiving yards, and then 3 touchdowns. It was a good year for Zaccheaus, and how Kingsbury used him as a 5'8", 193-pound slot receiver. The go-to route there, you'd think, oh, is that just like slants and stuff behind the line of scrimmage? Not necessarily. It's all it all tended to be shorter routes, and they did a lot of screens behind the line of scrimmage, but his number 1 route was actually curl routes, and Washington threw a lot of curl routes this past season. But think about him in the slot, running 6 or 8 yards over the middle of the field, and then turning and facing the quarterback and catching that curl. And he actually had a pretty uncanny ability last season to catch that curl facing the quarterback and then turn around and make that first guy miss. I think he had 10 missed tackles last season, and 5 of them came on curl routes. It was his most run route, and I think it was the most targets he had on any route last season. So a lot of curl routes, and then quicker out routes, 5-6 yards where, from the slot, you're really short stem and then break into the sideline. That was about 13% of his routes last season. Slant routes, again, 4 or 5 yards. This is not a player who was used a ton as a deep threat. He has some speed, and they did throw some vertical balls to him, but this is mostly curls, out routes, slant, and then in routes. Kind of think about underneath security blanket, quick hitting kind of stuff. And then he has a little bit of juice to make guys miss after the catch. He had 10 or 11 missed tackles last season. He had the same number as Terry McLaurin in Washington, same number as Justin Jefferson in Minnesota. It ranked in the 20s or 30s in the NFL, but still, this is a guy who has some real juice here. And I think over the course of his career, we've seen him fit in to this kind of role where he's not the number 1 guy, not the number 2 guy, at least ideally, but you could still get 500 yards out of him. The Commanders did this past season, and his last year in Atlanta, he was kind of a borderline starter in 2022 in Atlanta because all they really had besides him at receiver was like Drake London and a bunch of other, borderline NFL players at wide receiver. And so he's been able to be a 40-catch, 500-yard guy a couple of times in his career. Like, this isn't just like one big year, like a name from Bears past, like Cameron Meredith has one big year with the Bears and then never really does anything else. Like, Zaccheaus has kind of found his niche here as a role player who's got a fairly specific role and does that role to a really good ability, but isn't going to be a game changer or a game breaker, but a really nice complement then to what the Bears have at receiver. To me, it signals pretty clearly how much more we're going to see Rome Odunze and DJ Moore specifically, sticking to more of an outside receiver role. And that's not to say that Ben Johnson won't ever move these guys around, but when you've got, when you go out and sign a 5'8", 193-pound wide receiver, you're not necessarily going to play him on the outside as much, where he could be jammed more at the line of scrimmage by physical cornerbacks, et cetera, and you won't necessarily have him working the middle of the field with that speed that is so advantageous for him there. Doesn't mean there aren't still times when, you'll move Odunze or DJ Moore into the slot because you can find matchups for them there, but I think it signals that they'll play more on the outside and be more, more vertical weapons. Well, Zaccheaus can be, a little bit more over the middle, doing some of the dirty work there. From there, that's, as you look at your wide receiver core, like you've got Moore as wide receiver 1, Odunze as wide receiver 2, Zaccheaus is wide receiver 3, Tyler Scott right now slots in at wide receiver 4, and then, they've got some guys they brought back from last year's practice squad, like Samori Toure and Maurice Alexander, John Jackson. Like, do the Bears need much more at wide receiver? Then clearly they are interested in more at wide receiver, specifically Rondale Moore, who they're bringing in for a visit, as well as Mecole Hardman. We'll talk about them in a minute here. But like, I don't think you're hurting too bad if your top 4 wide receivers right now are Moore, Odunze, Zaccheaus, and Scott. Obviously, you always want more at wide receiver. You'd love to bring back Keenan Allen on top of everything the Bears have. They're like, of course, you'd love to use a draft pick at a wide receiver. But when I think about like, what does Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams need to be successful? If Ben Johnson can continue the kind of offensive success he had in Detroit, and if Caleb Williams can continue ascending like the quarterback we believe he can be coming out of college, in theory, like this combination should be enough. When you think about what Ben Johnson had in Detroit, where you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, you got Jameson Williams, that's your DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. Their number 3 was Tim Patrick. I think, Tim Patrick built very differently than Zaccheaus. Like, in terms of the kind of production you can get from that role, that sounds about right. And then like number 4 in Detroit was like Khalif Raymond and Allen Robinson. Robinson not producing much at this stage of the process. Raymond more of a return guy. Like, they never had, elite depth at receiver in Detroit for Ben Johnson, and the offense was able to be super, super productive. And if Caleb Williams can, play quarterback at a high level, like he shouldn't, quote unquote, need a lot more than that at wide receiver. Again, give him more. Absolutely. I'm not saying that doesn't mean no, you should not sign anyone else, but the point being like, that need feels fairly filled. And if you have the opportunity to add more, then absolutely go out and do it. But it's not like, oh my gosh, the Bears still have to really address wide receiver. Now, they want to add more depth at that position because you're going to need more than 4 bodies with legitimate like NFL experience there. And that's why they go out and bring in guys like Rondale Moore and Mecole Hardman for a visit for a workout on Monday. So we'll take a look at what those two might offer and what other options the Bears might have if they want to add at wide receiver. Plus, we'll get to tight ends and running backs next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. So if you're riding chalk and want to go with a bunch of the favorites, that's fine. Or if you got some underdogs you're hoping to follow through, FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. Plus all your other favorite sports. Major League Baseball is underway, hockey, NHL, soccer, tennis, boxing, NBA. You can even bet ahead on the NFL draft, all in a FanDuel app that's simple to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com for your chance at $200 in bonus bets and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. So the Bears don't seem to be done after signing Zaccheaus. They want to add more depth at wide receiver. It's not going to be any kind of big names, though. We're not looking at, Tyler Lockett or, certainly Keenan Allen, some of these other perhaps more expensive wide receivers that are still out there in free agency. Guys like Rondale Moore and Mecole Hardman have a lot to like as potential free agent options here, but are going to be close to, if not already, veteran minimum contracts here. At the time I'm recording this, we don't actually even have the number on Zaccheaus' contract. I'm guessing, given that he had 500 yards last season, it'll probably be more than the veteran minimum, but not something that's going to be particularly expensive. But we'll see what those numbers come out. But, like Hardman and Rondale Moore would both be, you're taking a flyer on a guy that you're hoping to get him back to production he was able to be earlier in his career without expecting or relying on him to have to be more than he's been recently. So Rondale Moore, you may remember as a second-round pick out of Purdue by the Arizona Cardinals back in 2021. Another one of these very small, 5'7", 180-pound kind of speedy slot receivers there. Had a couple of really good seasons with Arizona. He's a 300-400-yard guy, nothing too crazy and out of the blue, but left Arizona after 2023, signed this past season with the Atlanta Falcons, but in the preseason suffered some kind of season-ending injury and spent all of this last year on injured reserve. So Rondale Moore has not played since 2023. That's going to lower his value significantly. And then even when he was playing before, he missed about half of his 2022 season with injury, had a couple injuries his rookie year, I believe, as well. So in 4 seasons, he's played 39 games. He's averaged about 10 games a season. Although to his credit, he played the entirety of the 2023 season and didn't miss a game. So it might not be fair to just average that out over 4 years. He had one, season-ending injury this past season, which was tough. Missed half a year before that. But the other 2 years, he played most of pretty well. And he's got some, certainly some return ability upside. He returned quite a bit for the Cardinals as a rookie and then got back to a little bit in his third season here and there. But, the Bears still need to figure out what that role is going to look like in this current offense, whether that's, Tyler Scott playing a role in there, whether any of the running backs potentially get involved there. I don't think, Zaccheaus did a little bit of punt returning this past season for Washington, so he could be potentially in that conversation, but it still feels to me like the Bears' number one return man this season may not be currently under contract, at least not on kickoff returns. Scott and maybe Odunze or maybe Zaccheaus, those guys have done punt returns before, and same with Josh Blackwell and some other guys on defense, but kickoffs, we'll see what that ends up looking like for this team moving forward. But somebody like Rondale Moore could definitely be in that conversation as part of him trying to make an NFL team and trying to get back to, a career that looked very promising early on as a second-round pick with plenty of upside. And he's also a guy you can hand the ball off to in some different situations and get some rushing upside. He had a rushing touchdown in 2023 with the Cardinals in there. So there's a lot to like there. Or another former second-round pick in Mecole Hardman from the Kansas City Chiefs, who we all remember as a 3-time Super Bowl champion. And he did make the Pro Bowl his rookie season. I believe it was more as a return man because he had a kickoff return touchdown and averaged a pretty good high kick return rating. He's another guy who could make the team more for special teams at this stage of his career. Because while Hardman had some flashes in Kansas City, had almost 700 yards in 2021 as a borderline starter for them, we haven't heard much from Mecole Hardman really since then. The last 2 or 3 seasons here have been pretty quiet. He ended up back in Kansas City after a brief stint with the New York Jets, and this past season he had 12 catches for 90 yards. This was, number 5 wide receiver and special teams player when he was active for them. Did some punt returning and a little bit of kick returning for them, and that could be a nice pathway to playing time for the Chicago Bears. The real connection here for Mecole Hardman, well, 2 of them. One, Ryan Poles was in that Chiefs front office when they drafted Hardman in the second round out of Georgia, but also then Eric Bieniemy was his offensive coordinator for a number of those seasons, 3 or 4, I think, in Kansas City. And so you've got that connection there of a guy who knows how to use him, even though, the guy, he's not the offensive coordinator here, he's the running backs coach now, but still, it's about sort of knowing the player that you're getting in terms of how he carries himself off the field, how he participates at practice, how he is in the workroom, in the weight room, and Bieniemy can be some guidance there. The same way that he's been able to kind of keep tabs on somebody like Joe Thuney coming over from the Kansas City Chiefs, where Poles and Bieniemy have some nice history there that makes those signings feel a little bit safer there. And then for Mecole Hardman, like, again, because he only had less than 100 yards last season, this is a veteran minimum type of free agent signing. But you feel like, man, if he's healthy and ready to go with a change of scenery here in an offense, like if Ben Johnson can use him properly, like, you could see a possibility where a veteran minimum player, you get back to the guy who was getting 500, 600, 700 yards a season his first 3 years, and you could get some really good value if you squeeze it out. And if he just doesn't have it anymore for whatever reason and just can't get back to that level of play, you're not risking that much because he was such a cheap contract and such a cheap potential signing there. So curious to see if the Bears pull the trigger on either of those two veterans they brought in for visits on Monday, or any of the other free agent wide receivers out there. If they're looking for this style of like role player, number 3, number 4 type guy who's not going to cost a bunch of money. A couple of names that are still out there that we've thrown out in the past, but haven't signed with teams yet. Josh Reynolds, formerly of Ben Johnson's Detroit Lions for 3 seasons there, but spent this past season with the Broncos and the Jaguars, was a cap casualty from the Jaguars. He's been a number 3, number 4 receiver in this exact Ben Johnson offense before. I think that would make a lot of sense for a reunion if the price was right there. He really had a drop off this year after he had 600 yards in 2023 with Ben Johnson. So you feel like he could be a real role player here and not just a flyer on a guy that you might hope becomes something. Or if you're looking for somebody else who has some of that return game upside, somebody like Devin Duvernay from the Jacksonville Jaguars, who worked with Bears passing game coordinator Press Taylor this past season. He only had 11 catches for 79 yards, but he's been a pretty consistent punt and kickoff returner for them. For them last season, and before that he was with the Baltimore Ravens, made the Pro Bowl in 2021 and 2022 as a return guy. So I think the familiarity there, he could kind of be the Bears version of what Khalif Raymond was on the Lions, where maybe, he's a number 5 wide receiver on offense, but he's a go-to return guy and potentially an upgrade over what the Bears had before in DeAndre Carter, who was kind of in that same role and never really carved out an offensive role, and that's totally fine. Like, I think for either of those guys, it just kind of depends on price. I don't think the Bears want to spend $5 million on a number 4, number 5 wide receiver, but veteran minimum or something close to it, that's when something like that becomes more approachable there. I think it's partially why you bring in someone like Rondale Moore for a visit, because he hasn't been a part of this coach. He hasn't worked with any of these coaches on the coaching staff before. Or at least he might have been in Arizona with the tight ends coach Jim Dre for a year or two. But nonetheless, he's coming off of injury. You want to see what he brings. And same thing with Mecole Hardman, where he was only in 12 games this past season. It's kind of been a drop-off. You bring him in for a workout and kind of check in and say, wait, what's changed since we saw you last? Whereas the Bears have coaches who worked with Josh Reynolds and Devin Duvernay as recently as like literally last season. So they know exactly where things stand with him a little bit more. But Hardman was also dealing with a knee injury last season that had to miss some games. So bring those guys in for workout, see how they are, and then you can kind of evaluate the broader group of wide receivers as a whole and say, who else do we want to add with DJ Moore, with Rome Odunze, with Olamide Zaccheaus, and with Tyler Scott? And I would imagine sometime in the next couple of days, the Bears may put pen to paper on at least one of them. For me, though, like, I think the bigger hole that still needs to be addressed and is going to be harder to address is still the depth at tight end. I don't love what they've got besides Cole Kmet, but it might be easier to add more depth at running back, where there's, of course, always room to add more. So we'll take a look at some of the non-wide receiver positions and what the Bears still do and don't need versus what would be a nice luxury addition next on Locked On Bears.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
So wide receiver is still the position in the crosshairs for the Chicago Bears right now. But it feels like more needs to be done at tight end, and there's certainly a lot more possibility for more to be done at running back. And that's where I kind of want to loop in this broader conversation about the weapons the Bears have. Because if we start at tight end for a moment, they signed Durham Smythe as a cap casualty free agent from the Miami Dolphins. And they brought back former undrafted free agent Steven Carlson, who was in training camp this past season, but didn't really end up cracking much of the lineup at tight end this past season. And that's really all about it they've got at tight end. They signed a couple other guys to like futures contracts, but no one with any other NFL experience besides Smythe and Carlson. And that to me does not feel like anywhere close to enough tight end depth right now. I like the signing of Smythe as a value play here for someone who should be cheap and has some familiarity with Ben Johnson. Obviously, really fell off this past season in Miami, but the year before that, 2023, he had 35 catches for 366 yards. Like, that's not a bad number 2 tight end when it's all said and done at that kind of production. But this past season was 9 catches for 53 yards, and if that's what you're going to get from him, that's not even barely a number 3 tight end in the NFL. And so it just feels to me like, well, it's worth a flyer to see what he can do. I don't want to go into the season with my plan saying Smythe is my number 2 tight end who I'm hoping to play a fairly significant role in this offense, because at least in Detroit, Ben Johnson used his number 2 tight end a decent amount, talking 30% of the snaps on offense. Like it's an important role that's not just a fill in for your number 1 when he gets tired, but someone who's going to be on the field at the same time as Cole Kmet. And, heaven forbid, Kmet has to miss any kind of time, even a couple plays with an injury. Like, this is not somebody you want to be the next option to fill in at tight end in your offense. So it feels to me like the Bears have to find some way to do more at tight end here. And free agency is just not it right now. Like, unless they want to spend a little bit more than I think they would like to at tight end, because your free agent options at tight end are extremely bare. Like, when you think about it from the perspective of like anybody who's ever been fantasy football relevant before, you've got Tyler Conklin from the Jets, who's definitely been a solid tight end, but he might cost you $7, $8, $9 million, and the Bears just don't have that kind of cap space to spend on a number 2 tight end. You've got somebody like Mo Alley Cox, who had some flashes earlier in his career for the Colts, but at this stage of the process hasn't been super productive, and he turns 32 this upcoming season. I like someone like Jordan Atkins from the Browns, who's been kind of sneaky productive, but he's about to turn 33. This is not not a productive group. Ian Thomas from the Panthers, CJ Uzoma from the Eagles. It's kind of gross. Like, Gerald Everett and Mercedes Lewis are 2 of the better options out there right now. And we'll see if Mercedes Lewis ends up coming back for one more season, but he too wouldn't necessarily solve the Bears tight end issue. So I don't know if that means, are you forcing yourself to try and take one in the NFL draft? There are certainly, it's a really good tight end class. I'm certainly not forcing myself to take one in the first round, but if you could get somebody later on like Elijah Arroyo from Miami or Harold Fannin Jr. from Bowling Green, we've talked about those guys. Luke Lockley from Iowa could be a nice potential fit there. Gavin Bartholomew from Pittsburgh a little bit later on. Like, there's some names there, but I don't know, is a 5th round pick going to make you feel better about tight end? But do you want to use a top 75 pick on tight end? Like, the Bears just seem like they're in a tough spot here. And I wonder if this is a position that ends up getting addressed with, like at the end of training camp, somebody gets cut from another team, and that's where you find your number 2 tight end, because I'm not sure where else you're going to find him. It just was not a very deep free agent market at all. A couple of guys at the top, Juwan Johnson, Evan Ingram, but like, it's not even that the Bears missed out on other great options here. Like Luke Farrell from the 49ers, or like Johnny Munt to the Jaguars. The Eagles signed Harrison Bryant. Like, it's not a good tight end crop. So that's why the Bears grabbed Durham Smythe to say, let's get something. But they got to find something else, because they just need more behind Cole Kmet at that position. I like the draft, but I don't like the feeling of I need to take one in the draft, because you don't want to reach, you don't want to push, you don't want to force yourself. But I do think at the same time, in the Bears' 2nd and 3rd round, they have 2 second-round picks and a 3rd round pick, there will be some tight ends there that are in the conversation for best player available. And there's a tight end who will be in the conversation for best player available in the 1st round with Tyler Warren from Penn State. Well, we'll have to have that conversation a little bit later on as we get closer to the NFL draft, because we're also going to have the running back conversation about Ashton Genty in the first round. Somebody like Omarion Hampton from North Carolina seems to be seems to be a first-round pick himself at this point in the process. There's guys like Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins from Ohio State, maybe Caleb Johnson from Iowa, Cam Skedebo from Arizona State. They could all be second or third round options for the Bears there. Like, running back is going to be one of those positions that comes up a lot in this draft process. And I do want to talk about the Genty decision in the first round in a little bit more depth in the coming days here. But I want to think about this in the context of, like, do the Bears have enough at running back? Like, I don't think they have enough at tight end. I think they probably have the bare minimum at wide receiver. And at running back, you could use a new number 3 because your running backs right now are DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson, and then last year's undrafted rookie Ian Wheeler. I don't think you need another number 1 running back. You could add one, sure, but like, I think all you need to get you by and say, hey, you've got enough in the backfield is Swift, Roschon Johnson, and then another number 3 running back. A new version of what they had in Travis Homer. That kind of player. Not somebody you're expecting to be a 1,000-yard rusher who's going to be a touchdown machine, but just somebody who's a good special teams player who can maybe rotate in occasionally on offense. And if you have an injury at the position, you're not totally screwed if he's the option you're putting in the game. And I still think there's some good free agents out there that fit that bill. Somebody like Jamal Williams from the Saints and the Lions makes a lot of sense with the connections to Ben Johnson there. But there's guys like Chase Edmonds from the Buccaneers, formerly the Cardinals. You've got somebody like Nick Chubb from the Browns. Dearness Johnson from the Jaguars has a lot of connections to this coaching staff. Cam Akers, Dante Foreman, Trey Sermon, right? There's guys where none of these guys are winning you your fantasy football league, but if they're going to be the number 3 behind DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson anyway, if they'll be cheap. They're reliable if you need to go to them. Gus Edwards I'll throw in there as well. Jeff Wilson. Like, there's some names at running back the Bears can still add. And I wonder if as we get later into free agency, if they might not just go out and add one more veteran into that mix. Because in theory, at the top of the depth chart, you should be able to get, with a better offensive line in front of them, DeAndre Swift should be able to be a 1,000-yard rusher for you. Like, you can get back to what he did in Philadelphia 2 seasons ago. He came pretty close this past season. You can get him back over 4 yards per carry, and he should be able to be a good enough running back for you as a number 1 running back. Not a top 5 running back, maybe not even a top 10 running back, but like good enough. And Roschon Johnson, even as a rookie, had 350 yards. Like, if you can get him to 400 or 500 yards, like, as he takes a step forward in his career with a better offensive line in front of him, like, those two plus some average number 3 running back in there, like, that should be good enough of a running game. You always want it to be better. You want to give Caleb as much support as possible. But, like, the Bears don't have bad running backs. They just don't have elite special running backs. And if you have the ability to add elite special running backs, that's hard to pass up. But it's not as though this is some huge weakness position where the Bears have the worst running back room in football. Like, I don't think it's quite that bad. I think it felt worse this past season because the Bears were constantly changing what their run scheme was and trying to find a run identity, and it was messy. And the trade Khalil Herbert in the middle of that process, like, there was a lot of things holding them back beyond just there were some questions about talent too. But I think they can be better in a scheme with more identity, the better offensive line in front of them. And as the passing game gets better, it helps the running game get better too. Like, there's a lot of ways that this whole group can be better. And I think Swift and Roschon can both be better and give you the minimum of what you need from the running back position. Add more if the opportunity presents itself. Absolutely. I'm drafting a running back this year. I'm not sure if I'm doing it in the first round, but I'm absolutely adding a running back in this draft. And there's a bunch of guys, we'll talk about them more in the coming days, like Tootin from Virginia Tech, Devin Neal from Kansas are 2 guys. Brashard Smith from SMU is one of my favorites as well. Like, there's a lot of guys to like that don't have to be a first-round pick, but we'll have that Ashton Genty first-round pick here. That conversation coming up in the coming days here on the Locked On Bears podcast, most likely later this week, barring big Bears breaking news in the meantime. You can be sure, whether it's a free agent signing or NFL draft pick conversations, we're going to break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen of the day. If you're looking for a second listen today, check out Locked On NFL. I co-hosted this morning's podcast with Tyler Rowland. We talked about the Cincinnati Bengals giving new contracts to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. We talked about the new contract for Derek Stingley of the Houston Texans, $30 million a year, making like like 50% more than Jalen Johnson. Crazy cornerback contracts. And then also what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers and the Giants and where they go at quarterback. So more football talk over on Locked On NFL. Come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity to bear down.